Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to be showing how to add some animations and some music and sound to the start screen that we've been working on in the past 3 tutorials. What I've done already is I've gone ahead and imported some sound that I'm going to use. I got some free sound from the Unity Asset Store, which I imported using the package manager. And you can get music and sounds from Unity Asset Store. You can also find free music and sound effects online, or you can make your own music and sound effects. So I've gone ahead and imported a few different things. I have some background music here. This is free casual game background music. And then I have some sound effects. So I have a few different kinds of sound effects that I can play around with. And if you select one of your sound effects, you can test it in Unity so you can see what it's going to sound like. And so I might use something like this for when the user is pressing on one of the buttons, for example. So the first thing I'm going to do just to test this out is I'm actually going to attach one of these sound effects to one of my buttons. And I'm just going to use the accept button as my example. So I will open up my options menu. Now, when I'm editing my options menu, since this is a prefab and I plan on using the same options menu in my in-game view, I do want to make sure I'm actually editing the prefab itself. So instead of making changes in the scene, when I have something that is a prefab, I'm going to hit this little over arrow next to the name of the prefab. So this takes me into prefab edit mode. So it's really important when you're working with something that is a prefab that you use the prefab edit mode so that you are applying the changes everywhere that you use this prefab. So I'm going to choose the accept button here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new component, and I'm going to start typing audio, and the thing that I want is an audio source. And if I zoom out a little bit, you can see there's this blue circle around the object that I've added my audio source to. This is for visualization for if I were to use a 3D sound. This is how far away you could go to hear it. This is a 2D sound though, and it's attached to a 2D element, so there's no need to set up 3D sound for this. So what I want to do is in the audio clip section, I want to drag in the sound effect that I'm going to use, and I'm going to use the one that I was just testing just a moment ago. And right now it's set to play on awake. So if I were to exit back out of my prefab edit mode and hit play, you can hear that the sound effect plays right away, right when it starts. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this sound effect. I'm going to go back into my prefab edit mode, and I'm going to select my accept button, and I'm going to change the audio source. Instead of play on awake, I'm going to uncheck this box. And instead, I'm going to add to the on-click button function here. So I'm going to hit the plus right here, and what this does is this allows us to make something happen when we click the button. This is usually used to link to a script so that we could run a function, but you can also make things happen in the scene. So I have an audio source that's in the scene. I can actually trigger this to play without writing any code, just by using this on-click event. So what I would do is I would drag the button into this slot. This is the button that has the sound effect attached to it. And then from the no function drop-down menu here, I would choose audio source and play. So this is going to call the function play for the audio source, and I don't have to write any code at all. This is just code that comes by default with the audio source component. So now if I back out from my prefab edit mode, and now if I hit play, it should not play at the start. So there was no sound effect at the start. And now, when I click the button, that's when I get the sound effect. So that's a really easy way to set up sound effects that play when you click on different buttons. You could have different sound effects to play for different buttons. So my cancel sound effect might sound different from my accept sound effect. Sound is a really great way to give the user information, and this would help the user tell the difference between when they're choosing accept and when they're choosing cancel. For UI and UX design, it's really important that we give the player as much information as the player needs. And so the best way that we can convey information to players sometimes involves using different aspects of information. So the text itself, accept and cancel, is one way the user actually reading the text. Another way is the sound being different. We could also change the color of the cancel button. That's another good way to give the user a little more visual information. So the cancel button could be tinted red and the accept button could be tinted green. So again, these are just ways that we can help convey additional information to the player. Now, I'm not checking right now to make sure that my colors are within my color scheme. This was just to show an example. So I would want to pull up the color palette that I chose to create my UI assets to determine what colors I should actually use for the tint. But for demonstration purposes, this is just to show that I could tint these two to be different colors to help convey additional visual information to the player. So now that I have a sound effect that I have set up to play on my buttons, the other thing that is usually useful to have in a start screen is some background music. So I'm going to attach my background music to the an empty game object actually. So I'm going to go to game object and create empty. And just so I can find it easier, I'm going to name it background music. And I'm going to add an audio source component here as well. This one I am going to leave set to play on awake. And for background music, we normally want it to loop. So I am also going to check the box for loop. Then I'm going to find the audio clip that I want to use. So I have imported some free background music. I'm going to use this one here. We can hit play to listen to it. I think it's going to be pretty loud actually. So when our actual sound effect is too loud, one convenient thing we can do once we add it to the audio clip is we can reduce the volume. And this is especially important with background music. We want to make sure the background music isn't so loud that we can't hear the sound effects. So I'm just going to set this to 0.4. And remember, this is set to play on awake, so it will start right away. And it is set to loop. Now when we hit play, you can hear the music right away. Now you'll notice when I hit the button, the sound effect is still hard to hear. So I'm going to turn the background music down even more. I'm going to bring it down to, let's try 0.15. So now I can hear the sound effect of the button over the background music. So that is a good balance there. The one other thing that I want to set up is a couple of animations. And so my options menu, this is not going to be visible by default. So I'm going to go ahead and uncheck the box up here to turn it off so that I am not seeing the options menu while I work with my start screen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a fade in. So I'm going to add a black panel that covers the whole screen, and I'm going to have it fade right at the start. So I'm going to create game object, UI, and panel, and by default it covers the whole screen. And I'm going to change this to black, and I'm going to make it fully opaque. Now the other thing I might want to do is I might want to make sure it comes all the way out past the edges. Since I have my default background color of my camera as black, it's not noticeable, but if I had some background art, then I might actually be able to see it around the edges. So I would just want to make sure that this panel goes out a little bit past the edge of the screen. So I'm going to set each of these to -5 so that it goes a little outside of the screen on every single side. The other thing that I want to do is I want to turn off raycast target. So I don't want this panel to block my ability to click on other things. This is purely for visual to allow me to fade in. So I do not want it to stop me from clicking on things. So now I have my panel set up to cover the whole screen. I have it set up to not raycast target, so it is not going to block my ability to click through onto other objects. Now I'm going to create an animation. Now I am starting to get a lot of stuff in my assets folder, so it's probably time to get organized. So I am going to make a new folder called fonts, where I will put all of my font assets. And I'm going to make another folder called art, where I'm going to put my art assets. And I'm going to make one more folder called animations. Now I'm going to go inside the animations folder and I'm going to right click and I'm going to create a new animation. There's a bunch of things that start with anim. So there's animator controller, animator override. But what I do want here is animation. So I'm going to create a new animation. I'm just going to call it fade. And I'm going to select my panel. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this new fade animation that I made and I'm going to drag it right down to right below the text add component. And when I let go, it actually makes an animator component, and I can see it's made a new animator controller here. So when you attach an animation to an object, it does link it to an animator controller. This is just how Unity handles determining which animation is being played. So we want to let Unity do this the default way. Now if I go to my animation window, which would be under Window, Animation, and here again we see a few different options. The one that we want to work in right now is Animation. And I like to dock my Animation tab down here at the bottom. So I'm just dragging the word Animation and picking a spot to dock this window. Now with my panel still selected, I want to take a look here in this drop down that says Fade. That's the name of the animation I just created. And I'm going to do Add Property here. And I'm going to toggle Open Image. And the one that I want here is Color. So I'm going to hit plus for the color. And the thing that I'm going to mess around with is alpha. So my alpha here at the bottom, it's 1 at the start and the end of this animation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this ending keyframe here. I just select that keyframe and hit delete. I'm going to go to about the 20 marker here. And I'm going to set my color alpha to 0. And you can see it creates a keyframe for me. If it did not create a keyframe, you can also right click and choose Add Key to create a keyframe there. Now I can drag to see that animation playing. Now if I go back to my project, I do want to make sure that this is not looping. I only want it to play once. So with the animation selected, just double check and make sure it only plays once. And now if I hit play, now that happened a little bit too fast, so I am going to just slow that animation down a little bit. So I'm selecting my panel, going back to the animation tab, and I am just going to drag this out, drag it all the way out to the 1 marker. Now I'll try again. So that looked like a pretty good fade. So now I have a panel that fades. So I have a fade from black into view my scene. And I do just want to make sure that I can click on the buttons. So I did set the panel to not block my raycast, so I can see I'm still hovering over, and I can click on these buttons. I'm going to go ahead and actually turn the background music down even farther just while I'm working, just because it is a little bit distracting. So I'm going to turn it down. All right, so I have an animation for my panel. The other thing that sometimes you might see animated is some games have the buttons animated in, especially if the buttons are on the side of the screen. You might see them animate in from the left or from the right. For the middle of the screen, it's not so common to see them animated, but maybe they would animate in from the bottom, sort of sliding upwards. So I am going to set up an animation for that just to show how that would work. So I'm going to go back to my project folder, and in animations, I'm going to right click and create a new animation. I'm going to say this is a slide in animation, so I'll call it slide. And there's going to be 3 different ones for each of the 3 different buttons. So I'll do slide 1 for my first button. Select that button. Now, one issue that we would have here is if you have chosen the animation transition here, then you would not want to attach a starting animation here that could cause problems. So my recommendation would be to actually create an empty parent object to attach the animation to if you wanted to have a starting animation and also have your animated transitions. Since I have sprite swap, this is not going to be a problem for me, so I can just attach an animation directly to this object. If you did have that animation transition here, what you could do is you could create a new UI object. I would probably just make an image. The reason we don't want to make just an empty game object, this makes an empty object in world space. We actually want the empty object to exist in canvas space. So I would just create an image. And then I would just actually remove the image component from this. So now this is an empty object that exists in my canvas space. And I could make this a part of my start menu, and I could make my start button a child of this object, and now I could attach my animation here. So I'm not going to do it this way though. Like I said, my button is just set up to have the sprite swap transition, and so it's pretty easy to just attach the animation down here, just like we did before. It creates a new animator controller. And while I'm working with this, I'm just going to turn off my fade in panel so I can see what I'm doing. So I have my start button, has an animation attached to it. I can go to my animation window. Here I would add property, and what I actually want to add is rect transform. And I'm going to choose the, I want to animate the Y position here. So I think that is anchor position. They're named a little bit differently in here than they are up here. So yes, this looks like the correct number. So here's my anchor position Y. That's this Y value here. And so what I want to do is I want to end at its current position, but I want to start in a different position. So I'm just going to delete that, and I'm going to use the move tool, and I'm going to drag it down so it's off screen, and right click and add key. Now I can see that animation happening like that. And I could go ahead and hit play and test this. There's that start button sliding in from the bottom. Then I would want to do the same for the other buttons, so I'm just going to do that quickly. So I'm going to create, I could actually duplicate this slide animation, and it's not going to name it very well, so this is going to be slide 2, and then I'll duplicate that one more time and call this one slide 3. And then I would attach each of those to their respective buttons. So slide 2 on the options menu and slide 3 on the exit button. Then I would go back to my animation window and select my options button, and it is set up right now to match the start. And what I actually want to do is I'm going to delete both keyframes so that it brings me back to where my current position is. And I'm going to add the anchor position again here. And I'm going to delete the starting keyframe and drag it down also to the bottom and add key here. Now I probably don't want these to come in at the exact same time, so I'm going to give them a little bit of a stagger. So this one will take a little bit longer before it starts. And I seem to have an issue here. It did not save the keyframe correctly. There we go. Okay, so now I can stagger these. So I will just drag these over. Now we can see that animation happening. Then lastly, I would select my exit button. Just as before, I am going to delete both of the keyframes that came in here and use rect transform, anchor position, and delete the start position here. Drag it down below the screen. Right click and oops. If you accidentally right click on the top line here, it gives an animation event option. We do not want to use that. So I'm right clicking in this second row here this is where we have add key. So if you, at any point, if you accidentally create an animation event, you will want to delete that. This will stop the game from running completely. So do make sure you delete that. So then I'm going to take both of these keyframes and drag them over so that it is staggering the animation a bit. Now if I hit play, I can see those animations in action. All right, and let's turn back on the fade panel and see how those all look together. So now I have the fade and the button sliding in, both happening. And I still have my options button set up to play my sound effect. So the process that I created to have the button play my sound effect, I could do that for all of my other buttons as well. If I turn that off, so if I were to select my 3 other buttons in my main scene and add component, audio source, uncheck the box for play on awake, and I want to use the same sound effect that I used for this button here, so I'm just going to click on it so it'll highlight it in my project folder so I can find that same sound effect. Select my 3 buttons here and drag that sound effect into this audio clip slot. Since I am using the same sound effect, I could actually just make an empty object to hold this sound effect, but it's possible I am actually going to use different sound effects on these, so I want to have the option to customize these. The other thing you can do, even if you're using the same sound effect, is you could adjust something like the pitch. So for example, my start button, maybe my pitch could be 1.1, my options button could stay at 1, and my exit button could drop down to 0.9 for the pitch. So now each of these is going to sound just a tiny bit different. The way that I set these up on my options menu, I would do the same thing. So I would hit the plus here in the on click. Now I do want to do each of these one at a time. So my start button, I would drag into this slot. From no function, I would choose audio source and play. And then the same thing for the options button, drag this into my game object slot. From no function, choose audio source, play. And same for the exit button. Drag it into the game object slot, choose audio source, and play. Now let's test that out. Now you can hear how the pitch is slightly different for each of these. So that's how I would set up an animation and sound effects and background music to give a little more life to my start screen. Thanks for joining me in this tutorial. I hope you have found it helpful.